Mark 9:42 to 48 is regularly used as a key verse or key passage for eternal torment. So let's look at why. This will be a little bit more in depth and slightly longer than my other videos, but let's take a look. So as you read the passage, feel free to pause and do so. You'll see that hell is used at least 3 times, and then we get to this bit in verse 48 that says, "The worms that eat them do not die, and the fire is not quenched." And now you'll regularly see this used by those who defend eternal torment as a blanket. This means eternal torment, obviously, because the worms are everlasting and the fire is unquenchable, therefore eternal torment. But let's look at where this is a quote from. So this comes directly from Isaiah 66:24. So you'll see the exact same line, but with key detail thrown in. So they is the righteous living will go out and observe the corpses, dead bodies, of those who rebelled against me being God. Now you can pause and look at the context in detail, but all the people that are alive will find the sight abhorrent. So that abhorrent is a key word to notice as well. I want to talk about that in a moment, or potentially another video. There's so much here to discuss, but ultimately what Jesus is referring to here is not living beings in torment, but dead bodies being consumed by things that eat dead bodies. Now, some will say the worm is a soul that never ends, never dies, but I'd argue that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, especially when we look at the other words used back in Mark 9. So let's take a look back. So every time hell is used in this passage, it is the word Gehenna. Now, Gehenna is a transliteration, a Greek transliteration of Hebrew, which basically means the Valley of Ben Hinnom. Now, this valley is just outside of Jerusalem. I believe it's a park if you go to Jerusalem now, and you can actually go for a walk through hell if you really wanted to. Many have argued that this is a garbage dump in Jesus' day. There is very little evidence of that. The earliest evidence we have is of 1200 AD from a rabbi making it up. But what we do have is Gehenna is in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and there's some key information about Gehenna that we can look at in Jeremiah 19. Now again, you might want to pause this and read it, but where you see the Valley of Ben Hinnom in verse 6, this becomes a place, Topheth. Topheth is a fire altar, but it will become a place called the Valley of Slaughter. This is not a place where people will be living in torment, but if you look down in verse 7, the carcasses will be the food of birds and wild animals, which is an argument against why the souls aren't eternal. Talking about eternal worms being eternal souls, and because of Jeremiah's use of carcasses and birds eating these carcasses, this is an argument against the worms being anything other than worms that eat bodies. Now, ultimately, this is still not a good place to be and a warning for what God's judgment will bring about. And it's something that we in the West, I think, tend to miss. We argue that the eternal punishment must be ongoing. Now, I'd argue that this kind of view actually fits with what's going on here. These dead bodies are undergoing a punishment. Even though they're not alive, there is a huge shame to be left unburied. That would be horrendous to know that that is going to be your legacy, to be an unburied corpse, eaten by worms, burnt by fire, eaten by birds. That is not something that you want to have as your legacy. Now, we don't tend to do legacy too much in the West, but this is something that would be a huge shame, and many cultures outside of the West would understand that concept. Now, going back to Isaiah 66, I said I'd touch on this word abhorrent. Now, the word, the Hebrew word for that's translated abhorrent here, actually only turns up one other time in the Hebrew Bible, and that's in Daniel 12. Now, those of you who know this discussion will know what Daniel 12 verse 2 is, but let's have a quick. So here we have one of the only references to resurrection in the Hebrew Bible. Many of those who sleep in the dusty ground will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting abhorrence. Now, people will say, look, everlasting abhorrence. But if you remember back in Isaiah 66, to get back to that, who is experiencing the abhorrence? It's the righteous, those who are alive. And notice where the everlasting is. It's against those feeling the abhorrence, the contempt. Those who feel shame, that isn't everlasting. And that's because they'll be dead. and there will be great shame because there'll be the unburied corpses. So let's wrap this up going back to Mark 9. So Jesus is teaching in Mark 9 that it's better to have life, even if you're maimed, than to die in hell. So it's better to find life than to be dead. It's better to find life than have the shame of being like an unburied corpse, eaten by birds and worms and fire. And so the worms and the fire may well be ongoing, but those who rebel against God will be dead and not tormented forever. So ultimately, find life in Jesus. That's what he's saying.